At the onset of the Revolutionary War, approximately 1 out of every 3 Americans supported Britain. How could this be? Most of us assumed that the American Revolution was a broadly popular movement, one that had overwhelming support from the common people. And yet, modern scholars estimate that less than half of America's white population actively supported the revolution. In this video, we'll uncover why so many Americans remained loyal to the British Crown and what happened to them after the war. The dominant narrative of the Revolutionary War is one of a united front against Great Britain. Nearly all Americans were outraged by the practices of London, or so it is presented. The truth is far more complicated. There was significant internal dissent amongst the American colonists. While there is some debate on this matter, the general consensus from historians is that about 1/3 of Americans supported independence. 1/3 supported remaining in the British Empire, and the remaining third were neutral or undecided. Based on these numbers, we can see that this war wasn't just a battle between Americans and the British. It was also a civil war, one that often pitted neighbor against neighbor and even split families. Perhaps the most famous example of this phenomenon was that of Benjamin Franklin and his son, William. William Franklin not only remained loyal to Britain throughout the entirety of the war, but also became the de facto leader of the American Loyalists. He did this even though his father Benjamin was, of course, an ardent revolutionary and one of America's founding fathers. Despite the evidence to the contrary, the myth of total rebellion endures. Victors tend to shape the narrative surrounding a conflict, and the Loyalists were written out of America's national story. So who were these Loyalists, and why did they choose to side with an empire whose capital was thousands of miles away? The first thing to understand about the Loyalists was that they were not a unified organization. They were a disparate assortment of groups whose reasoning for support of the crown varied. Wealthy elites were overwhelmingly loyalist. Landed gentry in the south and prosperous merchants in the north both had a vested interest in the maintenance of British rule. The wealthy often had close financial ties to Britain that were buttressed by personal relationships with British elites. As unfavourable as British tax policy may have been, these wealthy loyalists determined that, on balance, a revolution would be bad for business. Not only would their economic networks be disrupted, but it was not entirely clear what a post-revolution social order would look like. Indeed, landowners were concerned that their property rights could be abolished under a new regime. Another group that had an obvious interest in the maintenance of British rule were government officials, specifically those that had been appointed to their position by the Crown. These included judges, customs officers, governors, and anyone who was employed by them. These officials and their staff would almost certainly lose their jobs if the revolution were to succeed. Beyond the privileged, there were other groups that sided with the Loyalists as well. Many slaves pledged their allegiance to the Crown following Lord Dunmore's proclamation. Dunmore, on behalf of the British Empire, promised freedom to any slave who fled from rebel slaveholders and enlisted in the British military. Thousands of slaves took Dunmore up on his offer, bolstering British forces. Another group that largely joined with the British were Native American tribes, including the Mohawks, Seneca, Onondaga, and Cayuga of the Iroquois Confederacy. These tribes viewed British rule as preferable, given the expansionist ambitions of many of the revolutionaries, which the British had sought to check. Additionally, some religious groups were more likely to side with the British than others. Members of the Church of England, or Anglicans as they are called, swayed heavily in favour of the Crown. The Quakers, who are pacifists, were keen to avoid war. While they did not formally pledge support to either side, their neutrality was seen as beneficial to the British. Finally, we can observe that recent arrivals from Europe, especially those who lived near the frontier, were usually against revolution. Practical concerns for safety and stability were more pressing to them than philosophical appeals for liberty. For some of the colonists, though, loyalty to the crown was more than a matter of identity or economics. There was an ideological component that caused large numbers of Americans to side with Britain. Loyalists were concerned that kicking out the empire could result in mob rule or anarchy. This fear was reinforced by the fact that the revolutionaries engaged in aggressive and violent practices against their perceived political enemies. Loyalists were often subjected to tarring and feathering, public humiliation, and even had their property confiscated without any due process. Loyalists were concerned that these practices could become normative and widespread were the revolution to succeed. In contrast to the perceived anarchy and brutishness of the revolutionaries, the British had a de facto constitution that promised certain rights. This uncodified constitution was comprised of documents including the Magna Carta, the Habeas Corpus Act, and the British Bill of Rights. Citizens of the empire were promised a system that included due process, the rule of law, a monarch whose power was checked by Parliament, and no cruel or unusual punishments. While most of the revolutionaries called for a constitution that expanded on the rights promised in the British system, this was not a sure thing at the time. Nobody knew for certain what this new American government would be like. Some of the Loyalists felt that the revolutionary leaders were power-hungry tyrants, whose appeal to liberty was nothing but a rouse designed to trick the common people into supporting them. Moreover, the Loyalists questioned whether it was fair for the revolutionaries to plunge the land into war when less than half of the colonists wanted independence. Even if independence were desirable, Loyalists argued, it could be achieved through non-violent means. Choosing the crown over the revolution was not a mere opinion that one could casually express. It was a statement of allegiance that could significantly affect a person's life. Loyalists were branded as traitors by their revolutionary counterparts, and this could involve very real costs. The Loyalist experience was determined by where they lived. In areas under British control, their quality of life would be largely unimpacted. It was a very different experience, however, in areas under rebel control. Within the social realm, they were ostracized and effectively kicked out of polite society. This ostracization ranged from being disinvited to dinner parties all the way to tarring and feathering. Many Loyalists experienced legal subjugation as well. Some states under rebel control confiscated the homes and farms of known Loyalists without any compensation. Moreover, some states even imprisoned people for expressing support for the crown. As you can imagine, these pressures caused thousands of Loyalists to flee rebel-controlled territory. Most went to New York City, a British stronghold for much of the war. Others went further afield, fleeing to Canada, Florida, and British colonies in the Caribbean. While some fled, others chose to fight. Tens of thousands of Loyalists either enlisted directly into the British military or formed their own militias. These Loyalist militias engaged in guerrilla-style tactics against rebel forces and took part in some of the most brutal fighting of the war. This war did, of course, end with a rebel victory. So what happened to the thousands of Americans who had supported the empire? Following the war's end, roughly 80,000 Loyalists fled the country. The white Loyalists mostly fled to Canada, British colonies in the Caribbean, and even to Britain itself. Those that fled to Canada ended up becoming quite influential. The empire was happy to have an influx of loyal citizens in the territory and provided them with land, pensions, and financial compensation for lost property. Britain wanted to make a point. Those who remained loyal to the empire were rewarded for it. Today, many Canadians can trace their ancestry to American Loyalists who fled to the country. Some Loyalists chose to stay in America. In areas where tensions had subsided, they were able to quietly rebuild their lives and their reputations. In other parts of the country, Loyalists struggled. They, and even their descendants after them, continued to face social exclusion. and were never able to recover from the loss of property and influence that they had experienced. Black Loyalists, most of whom were escaped slaves, faced a more dire situation. They had to get out of America. Reintegration was not an option. The British, keen to uphold a very public pledge of freedom that had been made to the former slaves, evacuated most of them to Canada. They were offered land but faced immense discrimination and broken promises. In addition to Canada, some of these escaped slaves also went to Freetown, Sierra Leone. Native American Loyalists were also offered land in Canada following the war, as a reward for fighting with the Empire. Those who remained in America faced grim prospects. The natives had been excluded entirely from peace negotiations between America and Britain, and thus their concerns were not taken into account. Britain abandoned their land claims south of the Canadian border, which included large swathes of the territory that had been controlled by Native American tribes and were under British protection. With the withdrawal of Britain from the region, the Iroquois Confederacy lost a security guarantee that had protected them. After the war, Loyalists of every ethnicity were largely written out of the American story. The revolutionaries controlled the narrative, and to the extent that the Loyalists are remembered at all, they are mostly portrayed as cowards and villains. I'm curious what your thoughts on this topic are. If you lived in America during the Revolution, what side do you think that you would have supported? Leave a comment below and be honest. If you're someone who tends to prefer stability and continuity, you probably would have sided with the British. If you're more idealistic and open to chaos, you may have become a revolutionary. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up button and subscribe for more history content. Thank you so much for watching.